All right, we're going to talk about the basics of acrylic paint today. Acrylic paint is a form of liquid plastic, so when it dries in your palette, you'll be able to pull those little things out and it'll still be flexible. For some reason, it doesn't like to come off of the lid of your palette, so if that's going to bug you, try to avoid getting that on there in the first place. You want to put down newspaper to protect your work area. Bring in a painting shirt or something like that to protect your clothes. You should save a little bit of each color that you're going to mix in case you need to touch up an area. But when you really are finished completing your painting, the best thing to do to clean these out is let it dry. That's one way to do it with the lid off. Or you can take a paper towel and wipe these little puddles out and then go to the sink and clean it. If you've ever been splashed by a spoon at the sink, basically these little puddles act the same way. They'll splash up on you and splash paint water on you if you have a big glob of paint in there. And then make sure you don't leave my sinks a mess. All right, let's talk about your paint brushes. This paint dries really quickly and it's pretty easy to ruin your brushes. So these are brand new brushes. You can see a couple things. Number one, they're nice and white. The shape of them is nice and uniform and they spring right back to the shape they are in. As you work, you may notice that your brushes, the color of the bristles change. This one here is stained green, but you can see it flexes right back. It's still relatively pointy. And now let's look at some brushes that have been abused. So a couple things. Again, this paint dries really quickly, so this brush has been left with paint to dry in it. You can see that it's hard and is really not going to be good for much of anything. This one may have had a couple things done wrong to it. Number one, if you leave it sitting down in a cup of water, it's going to cause the bristles to flay out, and they just kind of have a short-term memory, and they'll turn into this kind of mop-looking shape instead of a nice pointy shape. Number two, the person might have used the bristles to mix the paint. It's better to use the handle of the brush to mix your paint. Number three, they might have been too rough with it as they were washing them out. You want to just kind of gently work the paint out of them in some cold water, and that will make sure that your brushes are going to be good to you the whole time that you're using them. All right, so let's talk about mixing paint. There's a couple reasons you would mix paint. Number one, to change the properties of that color, to turn it into a different color essentially, or to make it apply better. If you add a little bit of white to it, it's going to make it easier to get a nice opaque coat on it. So when you start adding some white to your red, you're going to start off saying, oh, that's a little too pink. I don't want it pink. But that color is going to darken as it dries, and it's going to look nice, and it's going to apply a lot easier. The other things you're going to be looking to change are those properties of color. So hue, value, and saturation. So hue is where a color lands on the color wheel. So if I've got a green and I have yellow and I've got blue, but I don't have a blue-green or a yellow-green, I need to be able to mix that. So the way I would get this yellow-green here is by taking the green and yellow, mixing those two together, and I'll get a color that lives somewhere in between those two. Same thing here for the blue-green. If I've got green, I've got blue, but I don't have a blue-green, that's how I can get that color to be somewhere in between there. So that's how you change a color's hue. The other thing you can do is change a color's value. So value is just light and dark without changing where a color is on the color wheel. So our value, I can make a tint by adding white. I can make a shade by adding black. So that's a way you can change a color's value. The last thing you can change is a color's saturation. And a saturation is how pure or intense that color is. So again, starting with my green, I'm desaturating this one with gray. This is what's called a tone. And you can see I get more and more and more gray until I'm pure gray over here. So that's changing the saturation. Why would you want to change the saturation? Well, if you want your main object, your main thing to be nice and bright and in the forefront, these darker colors live in the shadows and they help push your main idea, your emphasis, to the front. Another way I can desaturate is by adding brown. So really we don't have any color that's just called brown, so we have burnt sienna as one of our browns. So as I mix more and more and more burnt sienna, this is the burnt sienna, I'll get a duller and duller green. The last thing I can do, and you can see that I get a similar color to just adding the burnt sienna, as a complementary color. So in this case, the complement, meaning the color straight across from green, is red. So as I get further and further over, And then I have my pure red over here. You can see that I've also made desaturated versions of red by adding green to them. So that's another way to desaturate a color. All right, now we're going to talk about mixing paint to get the colors that you need. So this is the image I'm going to be using as a reference while I work today. And we've got a green that's pretty similar to this one, but we've got a little bit more of a yellow in it, and then we get a more of a blue-green over here to a yellow-green here to a really bright yellow and white here. So that's the purpose of needing to mix some paint. So I don't have this color, which I need for my project. So I've got yellow, and if I want to try to make any of these greens, I can find blue, which is the next primary color, and I know that when I take those two colors and mix them together, I'm going to get some variety of these colors here. But the trick is I've got lots of different blues. Right now we have 5 different blues that we could use, and I also have blue-green as an option in the bottle, and I have a green in the bottle. So I've got lots of different things I could mix with this yellow to come up with a yellow-green. So I'm going to show what some of those look like and how to mix that paint. One of the first things I need to do is pick the right yellow to start with. So I've got 3 different yellows here in the bottle. Fluor means fluorescent yellow. Quart just means the size of the bottle. Then I have chrome yellow and I have deep yellow. Deep yellow is actually a yellow orange. That is definitely not what I need for this, so I'm going to put that off to the side. Then I'm left with these two. Fluorescent, most of the fluorescent colors are very bright, but they are very translucent. That makes them kind of a troublemaker. So unless you really need it, I'm going to stay away from yellow. So that leaves me with chrome yellow as my option. Okay, so what I've done here is started with lots of puddles of yellow. You can see I've already mixed these into a yellow-green. I've got 1 puddle left, and I've got over here all the possible different blues and greens that I could mix into there. So the last one is this fluorescent green. So I'm just going to take a glob of that on the end of my paintbrush, and I'm going to mix it into here. So notice that I'm using the handle of my brush instead of the bristles, and I'm going to mix that in there, and you'll see quickly how that turns into a yellow-green. Those fluorescent colors aren't very powerful, so I added a little bit more to it than most of the other blues here. So it didn't quite turn it enough, so I'm going to add a little bit more. So you can always add a little bit more when you do it that way. I don't want to see you squirting the bottles of paint directly into, another color. It's really hard to gauge and get just the right amount, so make sure you use the kind of dot and dab method, so you can just add a little bit more at a time. You can always add a little bit more, but once you put too much in, it's really not easy to overcome that. And then I've got my strip of scrap paper here. The black line just kind of shows me how translucent this color is. You can see I've got lots of different yellow greens out of my mixtures here. And then I've got a spot here for this last one. And you can see that they're very splotchy because I didn't add any white to them. Here you can see all the different yellow greens I've gotten by mixing different types of blues into my chrome yellow. So you don't have to do this for every color that you're mixing, but if you start off by mixing 2 colors and they're just not even in the right ballpark, rather than keep adding more and more of them, maybe you're using the wrong colors to start with. So that's why you want to start small, get just a couple little dots of the colors, get the ratios right, get the colors right, then you can go back and start mixing more and more. The other thing I wanted to show you is just mixing real quick. So all these colors, you can see I've got 2 different versions of it. This one's without any white added, and you can see it's very translucent, real splotchy. You can see where it's a little bit thicker. It's a darker color. I don't want that. So you can see by adding a little bit of white to each of these, I'm getting a better coating and a better color. All right, so what I've got here is a color study for my tennis ball. So I've mixed up all the colors that I feel like I need, from this color right here that is the main color of most of the tennis ball to brightened versions of that. And so what I mean by brightened is I added some more yellow, and I also added some white to bring that up. And then over here I've got darkened versions of that. So for the darker versions of that, or for the shadows, I actually added a little bit of blue and some black. so that it's getting colder and getting to be a good shadow color. You can see this one here, I've got a black line running through this whole thing just so I can see how each of these colors is going to coat. This one's not quite making the cut right now, so I'm going to add a little bit more white to this. I'm going to apply it again and see if I like the result of that. Okay, so this is the new version of that color. You can see it covers quite a bit better. Last thing I'm going to do is use this as an opportunity to show you what colors look like and how they darken as they dry. So you can see that this color, as I am applying it on here, is a bit lighter than the color when it's dry. So keep that in mind if you really want to see what a color looks like. Wait for it to dry and make sure you're checking how well it coats. All right, let's talk about using your brushes for a second. One of the main brushes I use is the flat brush. The reason I like it is because it really helps me get like big areas covered, but also start off with getting along the line. So I can do that a couple ways. I can just come right up that line and pull away from it. I can kind of come in at an angle along that line as well. The one thing you don't want to do is get a huge glob of paint on your brush and then just try to start spreading it out. It's really hard to get it nice and even if you've got all that extra paint. Last thing I'll show you is using your round brush. So the round brush, if you just glob it up full of paint and put it on there, you can see it's going to make a really wide line. That might be okay, but if you're trying to make a skinny line, what I do is in my palette, I take the brush and I give it a little twist. Make sure I don't have too much paint in it. And in my palette, I take it and I give it just a twist. And what that will do is get the point of that to be a lot smaller. And if you push a little bit harder, it'll make a wider line. But if you do that, that will help you as you paint. Before you start painting, it's important to have a game plan of what kind of style you'd like to paint in. So here's my original image. Here's a hard edge version of that, pointillism, cross-hatching, dry brush, and a smooth blend. And I'm going to show you how to make each of those styles. For a hard edge type painting, what I did was take the original image and kind of draw it where I saw the colors changing. So I kind of made a hard line right there. That's why we call it a hard edge painting, and mixed up colors that would show each of those transitions. And this was the outcome. This is a pointillism style. I used lots of dots to create the transition and try to get the paint to mix a little bit on the project as I went. This is a cross-hatching style. Basically, it's made of lots of little X's. This is what's called a dry brush technique. Dry meaning that, yes, it doesn't have any water in it, but really dry meaning that it doesn't have a lot of paint in it. So you'll, as you see me work on this one, first off you'll see that I have this pretty beat up brush. Hopefully none of your brushes look like this one. And I'll be trying to get rid of as much paint out of the brush as I can until it leaves just a scratchy kind of mark. So that's what I'm looking for the dry brush. This is a smooth blending technique. This is probably the hardest one to do with acrylic paint because it dries so fast. So you'll see me adding lots of color onto the project as I go, and lots of the original color to help kind of blend and smooth from one color to another. This is a quick review of all the styles that I showed you how to paint today. All of them start with the original image and mapping out where each of those colors should change. The hard edge, you have to be able to paint nice straight lines. Pointillism is lots of little dots. Cross-hatching is little X's. Dry brush is a really scratchy, nasty brush. If you need to borrow one of those, come see me. I can find you one. And smooth blending involves lots of wet paint on there and blending and trying to get that paint to really mix on the project. These four here started with painting a good solid base of the main color first. The hard edge did not, because each area was going to be its own separate color anyway. Go team.